too, given the size of the market. How does the U.S. government, how does the taxpayer protect itself against monopoly pricing? I'm often assured that commercial providers would automatically cost less than government service. But if I'm a commercial provider and there is no government competitor, I'm led to ask why I should offer you a price that would be lower than that the government could do. And if I'm on the taxpayer side of the equation and I am being asked to provide a price or a cost higher than that the government cost would be, why should I subsidize you? If you're a commercial provider and you can't beat the government deal, I mean, that's crazy. So why is there a threat from a government provider of human spaceflight services by putative commercial providers? If you can't beat the government deal, you shouldn't be in business, and if you can beat the government deal, I ought to get the best deal that you can make as an American taxpayer. So how do we protect ourselves from monopoly pricing? I don't have the answer to that unless there is some competition. The other thing, of course, is we don't have any of these commercial providers yet. What if it doesn't happen? What if it turns out to be harder than people thought? Gee, that's never happened to me. Something turned out to be harder to develop than I thought. I'm shocked. If there's a government capability, then we're okay. We can try again with commercial providers. If there's not a government capability, then we continue to buy from Russians. So I would ask, further, how is it a commercial enterprise if the government is providing upfront money, if the only market that is currently foreseen of any size is a government market, and if the government has to indemnify the company against egregious losses in order to keep the company in business? I actually ran a commercial company at one point in my career. I would have been happy to have any of those three conditions, not all of them, never mind all of them. But exactly how is it a commercial enterprise when it's a government market with upfront government money and government indemnification against loss? That tastes to me like what we call a prime contract, or more technically a negotiated contract with industry, which is what the government uses to accomplish government purposes, to accomplish public purposes, when there is no existing market. And there's nothing at all wrong with those. I've spent my life on one side or another of government prime contracts. It's what we as a society use to accomplish certain purposes. Now, it can be done well or it can be done poorly. But as a contractual instrument, there's nothing wrong with it. But what is being asked for by putative commercial providers today smells to me like, I want to be a government prime, I just want you to call me commercial. And I frankly don't approve. I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we think the role is of a national space program and a national space agency? I think the Congress of the United States actually thought that out quite well 50-plus years ago and when the Space Act was authored. It's an interesting document to read even today. I have a copy of it on my hard drive. I would urge you who have not read it to read it. I think the purposes that are outlined for a national space program in the 1958 Space Act speak to us today across 52 years. There's nothing wrong with what it said to do. We seem to have lost sight of the fact that that is still the law. In that vein, we seem, as I said earlier, to be setting up for an adversarial position between government enterprises and commercial enterprises, something I think which would serve us extremely poorly if it were allowed to continue, and which we don't do in any other area. It's fully understood that the majority of government people and government cargo travel by means of purchasing tickets or bills of lading on commercial airlines. A friend of mine and Becky's is an American Airlines pilot who has had duty in the Air Force Reserve flying cargo to Iraq on commercial carriers. Government accomplishes a lot of government purposes by buying commercial space. But if the shooting gets hot in Iraq again, or if a commercial provider wants too much money, or if, there is still military airlift command. The government does not choose, when strategic purposes are at stake, the government does not choose to give up its own capability to favor commercial contracts exclusively, for precisely the reasons I have mentioned. So to pose a situation where there has to be an either-or choice, as being put forth to us by this administration, I think is wrong policy. I think also that there has been much mudslinging, a lot of heat, not much light, on both sides of the argument, where those who favor continued government spaceflight programs point out all the flaws with commercial entities, and of course commercial entities are not loath to point out how disgustingly inefficient government is. We're at risk of blaming dogs for being dogs and cats for being cats. Okay? Government programs and government efforts and commercial efforts, government enterprises and commercial enterprises are different things and are meant to be, and they each have advantages and disadvantages, and they have purposes in our society. And the United States, in my view, owes its position in the world to a formerly artful blending of these purposes and capabilities, far from perfect, but better than most other people manage to do. So let me outline some of what I see the differences being. First of all, a government enterprise is generally something for which there exists no public market. Government is generally speaking the only or the major consumer. So it's a public purpose, and the risk is adopted as a public risk, meaning public funds are put in, or in some cases lives are at risk, or whatever. But these are public purposes with public risks. Government is the entity that we as a society use to spread these risks. Now, this could be recovery from Katrina, recovery from a Gulf oil spill, it could be a war in the Mideast, it could be a space program. Okay, it could be Hoover Dam or the Tennessee Valley Authority. It could be a purpose of which you approve or a purpose of which you don't. We've all lived long enough to have seen plenty of all those kinds. The point is that through what we regard as democratic processes, we decide that a certain purpose is to be accomplished. It isn't market-driven or market-based, and so it will be publicly funded at public risk for public purposes. Now, when we do those things, such efforts are accompanied by lots and lots of rules and regulations, which are incredibly inefficient. I've spent probably 80% of my life in public service. The rules that we have to operate on in public service are incredibly inefficient. It is a good thing the United States is so rich, because we waste a lot of money through the means that we choose to accomplish many of these public purposes, whether you're talking about building highways or building spacecraft. So it is trivial, it is trite, it is sophomoric to point out that industry could do it much better. In fact, government project managers could do it much better if allowed to. And I've participated in many, many classified spaceflight development programs which were accomplished effectively and inefficiently under the protective blanket of classification, to allow managers to do what they need to do without having a lot of outside scrutiny. However, those programs are the exception rather than the rule, because in a democratic society, we choose purposefully to inflict inefficiency on our various executive branch program managers rather than to be subject to the anti-democratic exercise of arbitrary authority. Our Constitution from its earliest days was set up on purpose by our framers to first and foremost prevent the untrammeled exercise of executive branch authority. And it reaches from the basic principles that organized and structured the Constitution right down to federal acquisition law affecting a spacecraft program manager. If I'm a spacecraft program manager for the government, I can't just go out and do what seems to me to be the most sensible, no matter how much skill, education, or experience I may have. I have a lot of people I have to keep happy. It's the law. It's the way we do it in order to prevent the untrammeled exercise of executive authority. So to blame executive agencies of government for acting as they are told to act is silly. And I'll quote Werner von Braun, who said, you know, it is inefficient, and I'm not quoting exactly, he said it acknowledged the inefficiencies, pointed out that he had run a space program under a tyranny and run a space program under a democracy, and all things being equal, he'd take the latter. I think Dr. von Braun was right about that, as he was about a number of other things. So for commercial enterprises to say that government is inefficient is like me saying that 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, no kidding. Now, commercial enterprises are typified by many customers and many suppliers competing for a limited business base. The winners win and the losers go do something else. That's when it works well. It's market-driven. The products of a commercial marketplace are built to a perceived need, and the ones who win are the ones who are best at perceiving the need. And the buyers have to buy what's available. If you want a special purpose limousine built, you can have that done, but it's not a commercial product. It's going to be built to your order, and you'll pay what it costs, and it'll be a lot. The development is done at private risk, in private hands, and the product which is offered on an arm's length transactional take-it-or-leave-it basis. Public funding is not at risk, or not substantially at risk in commercial developments. Now, certainly we can have private-public partnerships. We see that in Western democracies all over the world, Western-style democracies all over the world. It is entirely possible to have a private-public partnership with certain structured rules. But if we say that we're going to have a commercial spaceflight development industry, what's being offered is not it. Now, other issues that I would have specifically with the administration's proposals and what they do to human spaceflight. I like to think I know something about running real programs that actually produce real hardware that sits on top of real rockets and goes somewhere and does something. I spent the most enjoyable years of my life doing that. A feature that real programs have, whether spaceflight programs or anything else, are the existence of a goal, a date, and a budget. And those three things have to be thought at least to match up. In other words, it has to be a doable goal within a realizable date on a budget that the program manager actually thinks he can get the job done for. A real program cannot rely on technical miracles. You can have 1 or 2 aggressive developments in the course of a real program, but if everything you're relying on doesn't exist when you start, you're not going to ever finish. You can have 1 or 2 things that you really don't know how to do, and then you better have some parallel paths. Real programs are realized by turning existing technology into product. They're not realized by creating massive amounts of new technology. That can come about as a result of the perceived inadequacy of existing technology to meet the goals you'd really like to have, in which case you go off and develop it. But one of the 3 main causes of programmatic failure is to begin a program with inadequate technology. So you don't start programs with new game-changing technology. Program managers need control of resources. A government program manager operating on public funds who is relying upon a supposedly